For World Wildlife Day, I've completed a series of 6 videos that share the findings so far of my Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project on the implementation of and compliance with the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, CITES. During the 2 years of this leadership fellowship, I've undertaken a mixed methods research project to uncover best practices and lessons learned from around the world in order to try to improve CITES at a critical juncture of wildlife and the planet. In this video, I will share with you some of the main recommendations that have arisen from the legislative analysis, the literature, the Delphi Iterative Survey, and expert interviews. I will conclude with some thoughts as to future directions and where we need to go to from here. I've broken down my recommendations into the 4 components of the National Legislation Project, in parallel to the previous videos. So to begin, how can the authorities and prohibition be improved? There are still 5 members with no scientific authority. This should be an area to focus on. As illegal wildlife trade is a major barrier to proper implementation and compliance, further discussions about an enforcement authority should be considered. And at the least, law enforcement agencies should play a greater role in the conversations that are being had. In terms of prohibition, ensure all members actually prohibit violations of the Convention in native and non-native species, which was pointed out to me a number of times that not every country is doing, and certainly not doing consistently. The final 2 components of the National Legislation Project are penalties and confiscations. A gap in knowledge is a full overview of the penalties that are not only prescribed for violations of the Convention, but in particular the penalties that are actually handed out by the courts for such violations. A project to collect this information could be developed. Many participants indicated the need for greater utilization of financial responses to violations of CITES, such as confiscation of assets and proceeds of crime. This coincides with other global conversations like the Financial Action Task Force, which recommends a bigger toolkit to respond to illegal wildlife trade in particular. In terms of confiscations, at the Conference of Parties in Geneva in August of 2019, the International Fund for Animal Welfare and the IUCN shared their guidelines for how to approach live wildlife that has been confiscated. Efforts should be made to disseminate this information more widely and not just at a side event. Overall, there are several areas for improvement. Numerous times it was written or said to me, CITES needs to get the science right. This comes from both sides of the polarized debate about utilization of wildlife versus protection of wildlife. Non-detriment findings need to be robust and transparent, such as posting them to the CITES website so that anyone can see how it was determined it was okay to trade in particular species in a particular place. Next, suspensions are few and far between and toothless for countries where the trade is predominantly illegal. CITES needs to consider how it can better discipline non-compliant members. The National Legislation Project was a good start, but has largely become a checkbox exercise where there's no incentive once it's given a Category 1, which is not really an indication of good implementation. It also is nearly solely focused on the implementation of CITES for terrestrial species, and the poor implementation of marine species is ignored. CITES is a group effort. Importers should be encouraged to increase their scrutiny of incoming wildlife to ensure its legality and that a robust non-detriment finding has actually taken place. There is so much further research that could be done in relation to CITES to make it even better. Even though this may come across as a very critical project, only finding what is wrong with CITES, I, like several of my participants and interviewees, agree that CITES has been great, and without it, things would be worse. Also, that in today's climate of polarization, it would be more difficult to agree to such a convention. I'd like to acknowledge that some interviewees highlighted that most improvement has been seen throughout Latin America, Colombia, Peru, Argentina, Chile, all good legislation and solid science. In Latin America, though, there is largely a consensus approach throughout the continent and throughout the region, which was said to me was why it lends to why Latin America often gets ignored, whereas within Africa, the tensions draw attention. Thus, more studies about the Latin America case could prove valuable. A project should be undertaken to assess the independence of management authorities and scientific authorities. Data collected during this project indicates scientific authorities can be beholden to management authorities, thus corrupting the science and the convention. The utilization versus protection debate needs to be discussed head-on, rather than the cloud that hangs over most meetings. Formal discussions about the ethics of the consumption of sentient wildlife need to start taking place. Date if the national legislation project can be improved by adding additional criteria or being stricter with the existing ones. Right now, the categories do not reflect a country's true implementation or compliance. Take part in the emerging discussions about wildlife crime and trafficking being the subject of a separate convention or an additional protocol to the United Nations Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. CITES, too, could look to other conventions for approaches to protecting natural resources. One that was recommended to me, for instance, was the Nagoya Protocol, though largely thought to be ineffective, has lessons to be learned as to how the approach for protecting natural resources from theft might actually inform improvement to CITES. Thanks to everyone for watching and taking an interest. On this World Wildlife Day, I hope these findings can contribute in some small way to sustaining all life. This is just the first part of sharing what I found over the 2 years. There's certainly a lot more that I could say. To stay up to date on further outputs from my project, please follow me on Twitter at Dr. T. Wyatt or email me at tanya.wyatt@northumbria.ac.uk, and I can send you the forthcoming summaries. Thanks again.